Kate Falcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Helen. We're on our Saturday book here. This is the final video to talk about it. And I thought I'd tell you what I learned from the book about the Dogon. So we have to put a little bit of it into context. I will have to tell you that the Greeks considered music the highest art. I think because it was so closely related to math. Harmony was the number one religion for the Pythagoreans. They worshipped harmony. And if you think about spirituality in the terms of vibration, and music in the terms of vibration, and physics in the time of vibration, it starts to make a bit of sense. There's the story of Thestios that's been told. Meant divinely sounding. Thestios had, guess how many daughters? 50. Each one had a child with Hercules. This is like the 50 Danaids, the 50 Palantides, the 50 Nereids, the 50 maidens of the Celtic god Bran. The number actually corresponds with lunar cycles between one Olympic festival and the next. The modern 4-year interval of the Olympics, which didn't exist until 776 BC, long after the original myth about all of it, this was all timed in kind of exact emulation. It's not perfect, but it's close to it, of the 50. It's 48 months. They got as close to the 50 as they could. There's some speculation that the concept of 50 for half of the year, for 100 years, ends up being the great year and associates with the Argo constellation being half a ship in the sky. And it echoes the 2-to-1 concept of the musical octave. This is all very sophisticated. It's very difficult to understand. It all seems arcane and esoteric, but it's likely it was less so for the ancients. So Hecate, which was a form of Isis, a form of Sirius, had a pet, Cerberus, and he had 50 heads originally. Names have ancient meanings, and many of these myths related to Sirius talk about characters whose names mean heavy, as the star is heavy. And they talk about symbolic threes. And the Dogons, this is this tribe in Africa. So now we're moving down the continent of Africa from Egypt. They knew that Sirius was a 3-star relationship long before we found Sirius B and Sirius C. So there's a lot of stuff about names and meanings and origins and connections. And really the common thread is that these constellations of Sirius and Argo, and the idea of weight and strength and the number 3 and the musical octave and the connection of the sites on the map. All of this is like a code. It's an ancient code preserving knowledge. And the knowledge that they were preserving was our relationship to this particular constellation and particular star in the sky. And why? That's a good question. So the word gigantic or heavy has to do with also Briareus, who is one of the 100-handed ones with 50 heads. And this is an early name for Hercules, and Hercules was Jason, and Jason had the Argo, and the Argo had 50 oarsmen, and around we go in circles. Briareus had 2 brothers. One was called the Oarsman, and one was called the Orbit. And from these myths and the history that we know about for sure, we end up on the south bank of the upper Niger And who do we have there but the Dogon? Now, these were a people who were in closer times, sort of, were conquered by the Roman general Balbus in 19 BC. And they seem to be derived from the Kushite Berber people, who are of descent from the Garamatians. I hope I said that right. So Garamatians, who the heck are these people? Well, there's all kinds of people all over the world we don't know about, but these people have an interesting backstory. In mythology, Garamus was born of the 100-handed one and was given the sacred acorn from which the oak of Dodona was made, that grew, and then the wood made the Argos, and Dodona connected Colchis to Egypt. So there's this connection between Colchis and the temple at Dodona and Greece and Egypt, and then even earlier times, and then the Dogon. And it's no more complicated to the ancients, perhaps, the ones who had education, which were not all of them, of course, but no more complicated to them than the plot of some kind of complicated soap opera would be to us. So we would kind of know all these relationships. And so the Dogon tribes can trace traditional stories of their origin directly back to Sirius, the Argo, the Egyptians, Greeks. Herodotus draws a connection between the Colchians, the Egyptians, and the Ethiopians. And they all practiced the rite of circumcision. Nowhere else did, but it was fundamental to the Dogons. And also they have a 60-year ritual of Sigui. I don't know if that's how you say it. Herodotus also pointed out the Argonauts were blown off course, went to Libya, and he relates them to the founding of 100 Grecian cities in northern Africa, closely connected with Egypt, Greece, Libya, Colchis, and Scythia. And keep in mind that Timbuktu in Libya is the closest big city to the Dogons. So the people connected with Sirius tradition came by way of Greece to Libya to the Dogons. There's just a connection. Many connections in the names and connecting the areas and the preservation of traditional dress and their pottery and their ritual language. And there are all these parallel elements in the Mediterranean of the Dogon, of the Sirius system in the sky and relationships to it. And if we just stipulate that these stories preserve knowledge, then the mythological themes spell out the knowledge of the stars. I mean, it's just really pretty obvious. If you can get over resistance and wanting to just say, oh, well, these are just stories, maybe they're a way to protect knowledge in a pre-literate society. And if you can agree that that's possible, then the next thing you know is you have all these connections between these people. So an example would be the stories of Typhon and Anubis. They enshrine the notion of darkness symbolizing the hidden nature of Sirius. It's like, hey, we know that this star is not visible at certain times because it's below the horizon. The myths of an interloper and having a challenge in a test of strength is a symbolic way of expressing the light of the three stars competing and overshadowing one another when a period of time puts them in celestial proximity. Too complicated, interwoven mythologies and connections to really clarify in one little conversation here. But for example, the mentions of the city of Canopus on the mouth of the Nile had a temple and priests and sacred rites, and they were very exclusive, and they preserved ancient pagan traditions around the Sirius system. They were completely destroyed by the Christians in the 4th century AD. That area where all this stuff is very potentially preserved in archaeology has never been explored, never been excavated. What might we learn if we were to do that? The story of Aegyptus and Danaus, they were brothers and their grandfather was Poseidon. Now here we have once again this notion of half human, half god, hybrids. The repetition of the notion of hybrids is very interesting. Anubis, the jackal-headed god. We don't talk enough about what's below his head. He was a human. Very interesting. Aegyptus went to Egypt and had, say it all together, 50 sons. Danaus went to Libya and had 50 daughters. And they were both demigods, and they had to rule in service of the ocean god Poseidon. And, you know, just for the sake of tying them together, remember what we talked about. There are 50 male companions of Gilgamesh, 50 male Argonauts, 50 male Anunnaki, 50 female Greek moon goddesses. The brothers had 50 offspring, and 50 plus 50 equals 100, which is the number for Hecate, Sirius. There's a 50-year male orbit around Sirius A by Sirius B, who had 50 sons. There's a 50-year female orbit around A by Sirius C, who had 50 daughters. And the Dogon calls Sirius C the star of women. In myth, Danaus became the king of Argos, and that gets there on a ship with the help of Athena. And later the Argonauts built a ship with the help of Athena. And he draws the myth and the historical link, Danos does, this mythological character, between Anubis, the dog or jackal-headed, half animal, half man, and the werewolf. Now, this is interesting. There is a connection here with the more European belief in a werewolf. It goes through Egypt and Greece, and it points out that the jackal, the wolf, the dog were often interchangeable culturally across cultures. And therefore, when you talk about Anubis and you talk about Sirius, you're talking about something related to a dog man, a dog star. And let's talk about Cadmus. This is an Eastern constellation. Cadmus is the slaying of the serpent. Okay, this is in the Louvre, and I will post this picture for you in my community post. I can't show it to you. And it's, I forget if it's on a plate. It looks like a shield or a plate. And it shows Cadmus slaying the serpent. And keep in mind that these are all representative of stars. So Cadmus is Orion, and in the picture at his feet is the hare, which is Lepus, the constellation you would expect to be below Orion. And the serpent is Sirius. And we know that this refers to Sirius because it's got prominent teeth. They're not usual for a snake. Prominent teeth. And in Egypt, the hieroglyphs for the goddess Sirius are a snake with prominent teeth. It also shows a shrine with doves on it, which is the oracle center, associated with Sirius in the Greek tradition. And the story of Cadmus is about his travels around the religious sites from temple to temple. And at Thebes, he honored Athena, and she told him to sow the teeth, S-E-W, plant, sow the teeth of a killed serpent, the one that killed his men. And from the teeth would spring armed men. And very much like the story of Jason, he threw a stone at them. And they fought each other until only 5 were left. And the ancients used Greek puns, and so we would not understand this. But you have 5 left, and the Greek word for one of the 5 men who were left is the bite of the dog. It's referring to the dog star. The Egyptian hieroglyphics for Sirius include a thorn, which is considered the tooth of the plant, in reference to dog teeth and the snake. And the Egyptian hieroglyph for Sirius would be a thorn and a cobra, or a thorn and a snake. So you'll see a snake in what looks like a pyramid, but it's the shape of a tooth. And it's interesting, just as an aside, that the snake or the serpent or the dragon traditionally was the symbol for goddess religions in ancient paganism. And by extrapolation, they would refer to Sirius rising in the sky above the horizon as the teeth growing up from the ground. This is how these narratives actually had double meanings. In other words, now this is where now we're getting down to it finally towards the end here. In other words, all earth-born creatures are linked to Sirius. They emerge from the ground because of the influence of Sirius. This is coded symbolic language, coded symbolic writing, linguistics, stories, names, and geography. And it would be familiar to the ancients and was a way to preserve knowledge in pre-literate cultures, and often with only an oral tradition anyway. Yes, they had cuneiform writing, but probably 3 people. I made that up. But, you know, a handful of people were capable of it. It wasn't what you exactly call widespread. So coming out of the ground is a reference. It's a visual reference. If you see something rising up out of the ground in some of their art, depending on the context of what it's around it, the snake with the teeth, you know, what you're looking at is the influence of Sirius in the emergence of earthly beings. It's talking about the rising of the star above the horizon, so it's a double reference. Colchis, where the horses of Helios rose each morning, was our typical easternmost point of the rising sun for the Greeks. It was the farthest eastern spot where they thought the sun came. And Jason sewed his serpent's teeth there because Sirius, the serpent's tooth goddess, rises from that place with the sun. It's hard for us to draw these implied connections. And reference has been made to the fact that we've lost the ability, our imagination has been muted or diseased. But the notions of buried teeth rising from the earth, it's replicated in some mythology from incorporating every sacred temple site in the star map overlay. And the ancients were aware that these stories and traditions symbolize the appearance of Sirius above the horizon. So you get this repetition of notion of Sirius planting a tooth and having it emerge from the ground. They had a lot more intimate knowledge of the skies. Our knowledge of the skies is not very good. The word ark is related to argo, from the Greek verb to be strong. The story of Jason's return, the truth is only recognized by his dog Argus, who then dies immediately after he recognizes him. And the name comes from Egypt. It means the completion of a cycle. So only the dog sees the truth of which men are blind. The dog star Sirius represents a higher level of perception beyond human senses. It's a higher truth we can't recognize. So they're telling us in their mythology, you guys are, we don't even recognize this truth, this knowledge, but it's all connected to Sirius. Archaeologists found a temple of Isis from the 1st century BC in Italy with paintings of Egypt, Argus, and Isis, also known as Sirius. The mysteries of Isis are connected to the 50 daughters of Danaus from Egypt brought to Argos. The Egyptians spoke of holy emanations from Sirius and Orion giving life to the gods and the men on earth. The Dogon say that the seed of Sirius energizes the world. The Egyptians believed the deceased spirits went on in a celestial boat to the dark part of the sky, Sirius B, and then the Ka soul will revolve around the sun, go back to Sirius, and the cycle repeats. Hermeticists believe in an even ever-cycling movement of energy from the sun, like subatomic particles, basically, from the sun to the far reaches of the cosmos, the earth, and back in ever vibrating cycles, accumulating experience and returning the knowledge to the source. Interestingly, the Egyptian term for Sphinx is Ark-Ur. Remember, Abraham came from Ur. The Greek word for silver comes from this root, Ark-Ur. Argenteus is the Latin. Ag would be the chemical symbol. Who knew it came from the Egyptians? I had no idea. In Sanskrit, it's Arksha. That means stellar. So there are tons of different derivations that mean sunbeam, ray, sunshine, and even in Hindu, Arkina, which is a Vedic constellation. There's a reference to the fixed star, which is Sirius, in the mythos of Persia, the Zoroastrians. And the Zoroastrians in Persia talked of 50 gods, 25 of light, 25 of dark, who create an egg. And okay, what they're talking about is a binary star, which creates it describes an elliptical arc with two focal points, 25 and 25, and it's just fascinating. The 50-year orbit of Sirius B, whose orbit is egg-shaped, the Dogon knew this, the Persians knew this. How did the ancients know this? They had no technology that we know of. The Dogons also understood Kepler's law of planetary motion. I think we've talked about this before. We think about everything circles the sun. Circle. There's that word, circle, but it doesn't circle. It ellipses the sun. The path around is an elliptic. It's not a circular. The Dogon are descended from the Minyan, who were the last of the Argonauts. So there's these linguistic connections between Egyptian words and specific descriptions of characters in Gilgamesh and Greek myths and Dogon tradition. Words or concepts related to things like beast, hairy, dog, Sirius, serpent tooth, throne, horizon. They're just all in an interesting way connected. Then there's the connection of musical octaves, periodicity of orbits, map locations of ancient sites. There's a lost civilization under the Sahara that was once the empire of the Ghasamas. This is related to the Dogon. Remember, they were related to those people. It was destroyed by an invasion of Muslim Arabs. And this is really interesting. I had never heard of this. there's a story about a line of a total of 1,000 miles, not in one long 1,000-mile length, but interconnecting. Under the desert, still, there exists a series of tunnels, an underground water system, 10 feet by 12 feet, 10 feet high by 12 feet wide, hacked out of the limestone, connected in a network. The average length of any one is about 3 miles long. How did it work? Where's the entrance? It would have depended on regular rainfall, so it has to be from 3000 BC, roughly. It would indicate that there's a culture far more advanced than the Europeans and the Romans. And we can extrapolate from calculating today the number of a population and how much water it needs in that area. We would be able to calculate how much water that system provided. And around the time between 5000 and 1000 BC, this civilization, about which we know nothing, was raising cattle, doing agriculture. They appeared to be black-skinned tribes in a large area of the Sahara that was fertile by means of these tunnels of water. And these were called the Garamites. Garamites. And they were invaded by these Arab settlers of the Libyan coastline around 700 AD. 700 AD is not really that long ago in the larger scope of things. 700 AD, the Vikings were marauding the coast of Scotland and Ireland. So, just to put it into a little perspective. Herodotus describes that area as a great nation. In his time, he saw it. It was a great nation. It lasted over 1,000 years. 1,000 years? Who were they? And because of the fall of the Roman Empire, travel from Europe into that area stopped. And it didn't commence again until the 19th century. And by that time, so much of the evidence was buried. We know nothing about it. There are tombs, pyramids, fortresses, abandoned cities, all of them unexplored. The survivors fled southwest. They intermingled with the Aboriginal tribes of Upper Niger, and they became the Dogon. So the Dogon say that the shaper of the world visited Earth and gave men culture and returned to Sirius. And that's what I learned from this book. Fascinating connections between all these different cultures. And I would recommend this book. I told you a little tiny bit of what I was able to glean from it. It is replete with information, far more than I could ever tell you. It's just unbelievable. It's so interesting, intricate. Really a great book. Strongly recommended. If you remember, Temple wrote The New Science of Heaven. That was a good book too. Okay. I guess that's it. I'm sorry this is a little bit short. It would have lasted longer, but I can't do quotes from the book. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Something a little different for next week. I'm working on it. In the meantime, slán go fóill. Sláinte.